Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. HBO just revealed that it's casting the new Game of Thrones Night of the Seven Kingdoms prequel series. George R. R. Martin's also revealed a bunch of details about it, so we'll break it all down. It's also going into production way faster than we thought that it would, so we actually might see episodes pretty soon. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the episodes. Of course, I'll do videos for all the episodes just like I do for House of the Dragon, like I did for Game of Thrones, any of the other prequel series or sequel series that they wind up releasing the next couple of years. There's a lot of them. I'll talk about some of the other ones at the end of the video. House of the Dragon Season 2 episodes should release during next summer. They're still on track for that, even though there have been a couple of strikes. Don't worry about that. I've already done a couple videos about all the footage, the teasers they've released, so I'll put links to that down in the description below and at the end of this. But starting with the big stuff, Night of the Seven Kingdoms is based on the Tales of Dunk and Egg stories that George R. R. Martin wrote. They're 3 novellas, basically, and they were just collected in a larger book called A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which is where the series gets its name from. They might tweak the name just a little bit to keep it from getting super long, because like the full title now has a subtitle called The Hedge Knight. That might just be for Season 1, because the 3 Dunk and Egg novellas are called A Hedge Knight, which is a reference to Sir Duncan the Tall. Book 2 is called The Sworn Sword, which is also a reference to Sir Duncan the Tall swearing his sword to Aegon V. In the last novella, Book 3 is called The Mystery Knight, which, as you could have guessed it, big surprise, is also a reference to Sir Duncan the Tall. Within the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, in Westeros, a Mystery Knight is someone who competes in a tournament like a joust without revealing their identity or using a pseudonym or a fake name. During the Tales of Dunk and Egg, Dunk fights in a tournament celebrating the wedding of Sir Ambrose Butterworth using a pseudonym called the Gallows Knight instead of his real name. Probably the most famous example of another Mystery Knight in Game of Thrones history was Lyanna Stark, who fought in the Great Tourney of Harrenhal. During the tournament, a younger Howland Reed, seen here later in the timeline with a young Ned Stark, was bullied by 3 squires of other knights at the tournament. Lyanna Stark came to his aid, beat off the attackers with a sword, like while she was dressed as Lyanna Stark, like she had her dress on, then later entered the tournament disguised as the Knight of the Laughing Tree with armor that had a tree on it that appeared to be laughing. It drove the Mad King even more mad because he thought the tree was actually laughing at him, because you remember by this point he's grown incredibly insane, and supposedly the Great Tourney of Harrenhal was a ruse that Rhaegar Targaryen threw in order to try and call a great tournament and get the rest of the realm to support him deposing his father and him taking the Iron Throne. There were a lot of theories about that during the original Game of Thrones novels, like they never definitively answered if that's what Rhaegar's original plan was. Maybe we'll hear about that in some future Robert's Rebellion series at some point. But during that great tournament, when Lyanna Stark was pretending to be the Knight of the Laughing Tree, she defeated the 3 knights that those squires were serving, and the 3 defeated knights agreed to severely chastise their squires as a way for Lyanna to help get some justice for Howland Reed, because he'd been afraid to actually challenge the squires in open combat like you normally would in a situation like that. But the news you may have seen in your feeds recently is that HBO is now casting the roles of Sir Duncan the Tall and Prince Aegon V for a planned filming date during 2024. At least that's what the casting announcement lists. Like they're going to be filming next year, which is way faster than I think we expected. I'm still not expecting them to release episodes till like 2026, but if they aren't able to get House of the Dragon Season 3 out by 2025, we might actually get lucky and they just release Night of the Seven Kingdoms between seasons of House of the Dragon. A while ago, George R. R. Martin made it sound like Season 1 of Night of the Seven Kingdoms would only have about 6 episodes, so it'd be on the shorter side, but supposedly the episode count could wind up changing. HBO wasn't really happy when the original series started doing those shorter seasons, and they're not really happy that House of the Dragon Season 2 had to reduce their episode count too. But House of the Dragon is actually a good template for what Night of the Seven Kingdoms is going to be like. So when House of the Dragon started, a lot of fans were worried that there wouldn't be enough material for them to adapt a normal series, because the actual Dance of the Dragons, Targaryen Civil War that it's covering, only lasted for a couple years. Like, it was actually pretty quick. George R. R. Martin only wrote a couple short stories covering that, and the Fire and Blood book that he wrote is more of an appendices, like a Silmarillion type of book written by a maester who narrates when certain things happen in history. It's not written like an actual novel, like the main Song of Ice and Fire novels that they adapted for the main series. Like when they did the original series, they had really big novels to adapt for most of the seasons. Obviously, when the show started to go off the rails is when they lost all the material to adapt. Thus, everyone's worries when they get to House of the Dragon and some of these other prequels where they don't have a ton of material to adapt. But if George R. R. Martin is writing, he wrote on House of the Dragon, he's writing on Night of the Seven Kingdoms, helping them expand the story, and if it worked fine for House of the Dragon, it'll probably work fine for any of the other periods in history they want to cover.
Well, funny you should ask. Let me get my map.
So as long as he's the one that's actually expanding the material for those different time periods, I'm not worried about the story. Knight of the Seven Kingdoms would pick up about 80 years after the first Blackfire Rebellion, so the other cool thing about this series, they can feature the Blood Raven, Brynden Rivers, aka the Three-Eyed Raven, before he became the Three-Eyed Raven. He was very active during this period in history. He was a Targaryen bastard of Aegon IV. He was the infamous king who sired so many bastards that it put Robert Baratheon to shame. He hated his legitimate oldest son, who was heir to the Iron Throne, legitimized a bunch of the bastards, creating House Blackfire, which directly leads to the Blackfire Rebellion. It causes a whole bunch of problems. The survivors of that wound up going off to Essos to create the Golden Company. Brynden Rivers fought on the side of his half-brother, King Daeron II. Obviously, he was half-brothers with all the Blackfires, too. So this is another Targaryen civil war, like the House of the Dragon, Dance of the Dragons. It was just a bunch of bastards versus a bunch of Trueborn people. Brynden Rivers supported the Trueborn side, the actual crown, basically. The reason why he was called the Blood Raven, though, was because of a birthmark covering most of his face. And after his half-brother King Daeron II died from an illness after the Blackfire Rebellion, he became the Hand of the King and the Master of Whisperers to Daeron's son, Brynden's nephew, Aerys I, after he took the Iron Throne. Then Aerys dies without an heir, so the Iron Throne passes to his brother, Maekar I, and it's around that period that Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series would be taking place. Like, the story begins when Aerys I is still sitting on the Iron Throne, but after the Blackfire Rebellion. And before Aegon V's father, Maekar I, succeeds his brother Aerys as the next king. What they might do on the show, though, is because most of this takes place when Aegon V is squire to Sir Duncan the Tall, like when he's much younger and they're just having adventures going around the different Seven Kingdoms. But because Aegon V eventually does become the next king, and Sir Duncan the Tall becomes the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard eventually, they'll probably have some flash forward to where he actually becomes the next king and then names Sir Duncan the Tall to the Kingsguard. This is where the title of the collected books gets its name, because when you become a Kingsguard, you become a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms.
Arise, Brienne of Tarth, a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms.
So that's like the whole trajectory of the series. It's like the rise of Sir Duncan the Tall and the rise of Aegon V. But because so much of the series takes place when they're much younger, I think that's what most of the episodes will be. And then there'll just be like a quick flash forward at the end of the series to him actually becoming king and Sir Duncan the Tall becoming a Kingsguard. They're probably not going to do the tragedy at Summerhall because that happened way later in Aegon V's life. And because Aegon V was the younger brother of Maester Aemon on the main show Game of Thrones, we might actually see a much younger version of Maester Aemon.
Egg, I dreamed that I was old.
The whole idea is that Aegon V became the next king of Westeros as part of a great council where they were selecting the next king. But when that was happening, Maester Aemon was actually ahead of him in the line of succession. So part of the idea is that Maester Aemon didn't want to cause another Targaryen civil war battle over succession so soon after the Blackfire Rebellion, and he didn't want to leave the Maesters, so he chose to take the Black instead, basically leading the Great Council to select Aegon V as like the next likely successor. There was a brief moment during the original Game of Thrones series where Maester Aemon is talking to Jon Snow about his true heritage, like, I am a Targaryen, I had to sit through all these different conflicts, the rise of the Mad King, everything that happened with Daenerys, and I wasn't able to help them even though I wanted to. Like, Maester Aemon actually wanted to leave and help Daenerys when everything happened with the Mad King and Robert's Rebellion. So even though this is much earlier in the timeline, you still have like a lot of characters who were alive during the main series Game of Thrones. Also, Melisandre is like one of the oldest characters on the main series in Game of Thrones, so she could show up at any point during this part of the timeline. The other interesting thing, too, is about the Blood Raven's Black story. So when Maester Aemon took the Black and went to the Wall, the Blood Raven also took the Black and went to the Wall. He even rose to the rank of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch before he became the Three-Eyed Raven. But the reason why the Blood Raven took the Black was because of a separate event involving the death of one of the Blackfires during the Great Tournament. It was like one of Aegon V's first acts to actually have him arrested and gave him the choice to take the Black. So that's like a whole different video about the history of the Blood Raven. It's actually really interesting. So if we learn more about the character on the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series, I'll do a much bigger video about him. But when the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series picks up, he's basically Hand of the King, so it makes sense that we would actually see him during the series. Let me know in the comments, though, who do you want to play Dunk and Egg? I would totally be fine if they were unknown actors that we don't know anything about. I don't mind there not being super famous actors on any of the Game of Thrones series, even though there are a couple on House of the Dragon. They probably won't announce more of the actual characters, the casting, till next year, but they can probably do like a solid 3 or 4 seasons out of this, just like they're doing for House of the Dragon, like I said, expanding the story with George R. R. Martin being the one to actually expand the story. What they'll probably do, though, is that once House of the Dragon Season 4 airs, this Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series would take over, become like the main series, and then they do like the next sequel series, spin-off, and so on and so forth. There's still a bunch of others that they're working on, like the Jon Snow sequel series, the Sea Snake series about his 9 voyages, like the 9 famous voyages and conquests around the world, a Princess Nymeria, the 10,000 Ship series about the history of Dorne. There's that animated series that they're working on. There's the Aegon's Conquest series, which might just be like a future House of the Dragon series. The idea is that they'll do more Targaryen periods in history and just still call it House of the Dragon, but cover different periods in history. So it'll be like House of the Dragon, subtitle Conquest for Aegon's Conquest. The only series that I've heard about them actually canceling is the Flea Bottom series. I'm totally fine in them not doing that, but there's a bunch of others that we'll probably hear about in like the next several years. Like they'll still do Game of Thrones sequel series, spin-off series till the heat death of the universe. So I'll wind up being like 90 years old someday doing breakdowns for new Game of Thrones episodes. There's a bunch of big stuff coming up. Everyone click here for all my House of the Dragon Season 2 teasers and first look videos to learn about what's going on with all the characters. And click here to learn about that Game of Thrones Jon Snow sequel series. Thank you so much for watching. Everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.